Welcome to Sustainability Now, technologies and paradigms to shape a world that works. Designed for everyone interested in responsible stewardship of the planet, covering topics related to food, energy, housing, water, waste, health, economics, and consciousness. Welcome to your community, Sustainability Now, with your host, Scott Billy.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Sustainability Now. I'm Scott Billy, and today I'll be your host, and happy to introduce Cchris Neidl, the co-founder of Open Air. It's a global volunteer network that was launched in 2019. Their mission is to advance direct air carbon capture using open source crowd-based R&D and advocacy missions. Cchris brings about 15 years of experience in renewable energy sector in both urban and off-grid contexts from around the world. New York native, Cchris is joining us from Costa Rica today. Welcome aboard, Cchris.
Hey, thank you, Scott, for having me.
All right. Maybe you can just give me a little bit of a background about some of the other clean energy projects that you've worked on in your history.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I definitely come to the carbon dioxide removal really from a history and also a perspective I think I sort of developed in renewable energy. I was a lifelong interest in solar energy since I was a small child, actually. And it took me a few years after college to finally make the leap. And I initially trained as a solar installer in California, and then was involved in environmental education in New York City, focused around renewable energy. And that kind of morphed into an advocacy role, because if you're kind of doing environmental education about renewables in New York, particularly solar, you quickly bump into what some of the obstacles were that were really sort of facing solar installations. So I got really cut my teeth as an activist, really working on bills that would improve sort of solar access, solar incentives in New York State. And then I went to grad school at NYU, and I was sort of focusing on, how do you, sort of develop methods of communicating complex kind of policy issues around climate and energy to the layperson within an activist context. And my last semester, I took a class on solar, for development, so solar in the last mile, as they called it. And I really just found it really interesting and had a good rapport with the instructor who worked for an organization that did off-grid energy finance in rural areas with microfinance institutions. And I just sort of on a whim said, hey, what would it be like to, potentially, work in this field? And I landed a job unexpectedly in that first lunch conversation I had, and moved to India a few months later, and on and off, mostly for the better part of, 4 years, I lived in India working on, projects that were really focused on extending energy access in the last mile using renewable energy sources like solar and, clean cook stoves. That also took me to Afghanistan, working on a project for a while, and West Africa. And so I kind of soaked that whole thing up, and then came back to New York and worked more again on sort of how do we create a market for solar in New York City. And then started to work as a director of business development for some local solar companies. But all along, I was really interested in negative emissions, and my interest increased over the years. The more urgent and obvious it became that we needed to do it. So I decided a couple of years ago to take a plunge and start Open Air.
That's great. Yeah, so could you describe Open Air Collective a little bit?
Yeah. So back in the day when I mentioned grad school, one of the things that I really looked at a lot, I was really interested in what's called commons-based peer production, or sometimes it's related to definitions of open source, but the idea that amateurs and volunteers in aggregate can, pool their time, talent, interest, and knowledge to produce things in ways that, sort of firms or governments might not be able to, or at least they can play a role in that sort of productive ecosystem that is sort of unique and creative and fast. And so I was interested in that in terms of activism, and kind of really fell into the influence of a few sort of intellectuals or scholars sort of in that space, and started to apply that to my own work. Some of the programs that I was developing, both in Afghanistan, oddly enough, and back in New York, sort of had an element of how do you pool together people who can then help overcome certain barriers or obstacles to problems. So I had a real thing for that kind of general concept. And when I looked at carbon removal and the scale on which we did it and the time frame in which we needed to remove carbon from the atmosphere, and I looked at the parts that are normally what we were dealing with, is that you have the private sector, you have the public sector, you have civil society, nonprofit organizations, academia. And, I just wondered, this peer production or sort of open source revolution, citizen science revolution that's been evolving rapidly over the last 25 years of the internet, is this another factor that could be brought to bear on this problem, that could be part of this sort of ecosystem to drive and accelerate change? And so that was the idea behind Open Air. And it's quite simple. It's really about convening volunteers through the internet, not just to sort of focus their attention on, one or two sort of protest or sort of, advocacy goals, but more, can this growing community actually produce projects or missions, as we call them, that across the board help accelerate innovation and deployment of carbon removal solutions, and to really not have the volunteer sort of part of it be a sort of a temporary stage prior to it becoming a formal organization, but rather that's it. That's the permanent state of it. The more always volunteer, always people just contributing on the basis of their sort of intrinsic interest in being part of the solution. And I think another real important part too is when people come into Open Air and come to work on something, we divide our missions in terms of R&D, and there we draw on open source software, hardware, citizen science practices, and then also advocacy, which, community organizing and political advocacy have always had, obviously, a network volunteer component to it. So we kind of operate in those two domains. But I think the thing is, if someone comes into Open Air, there's always a thing to do. So the idea is that you attach yourself to some very specific goal-oriented mission that could be short-term, could be long-term, could be a piece of legislation, could be making something, and that you jump right in. You're able to participate according to whatever your own initiative, skills, time, and interest are. And that's how that has real implications for how we're taking shape. We've really been kind of live for about a year, and where we are right now isn't a function of sort of a central strategic plan. It's who came in, who did what, and who moved things in certain directions. And that's the shape of us, really, is the sort of the footprints of our most active activists.
That's really awesome. And so you're taking the open source software model and moving it to activism and solutions-based planning. I'm kind of curious how you draw people out, because a lot of the other volunteer efforts that I've been involved with, there's a lot of people who are willing to help but don't know what to do, and they're basically looking for leadership. So what do you do? What are your techniques for getting people to find their own path and help evolve the mission along, rather than just be order takers?
Yeah. And I should say too, what I described there, while it might be unique within the carbon removal space, and there might be some somewhat unique sort of aspects to how we're designing our community. But this is sort of a moment where many of the most momentous social movements that are happening right now are actually distributed in terms of their leadership and decision-making and creativity. So we have a lot of things to look at in parallel, and we've certainly drawn from some right within the environmental space. I think the Sunrise Movement and the Citizens Climate Lobby has been a really big influence. But what we really do, I think, and this is a thing that we evolve as we go, as we get to a certain scale, we realize, okay, we need to now come up with a system for this. And so one of the things that you just mentioned is really key to what we're working on now, is that when people come in, we don't want them to be overwhelmed, that they have no sort of sense of what's happening here. And then they get a fatigue and then they leave. So now we have a system of real onboarding where we use a sort of a one-on-one model. Someone comes in through our form, and within a few days, we schedule a one-on-one with one of our members and that person to find out a little bit more about them. What are their interests? Where are they? And then we give them a bit of a landscape of what we're working on, our different missions, show them how we all operate within a Discord server, kind of like a Slack platform, and make sure that people kind of understand there, and then kind of connect them to a buddy, someone, if we determine this is an engineer who's really interested in building a miniature direct air capture machine that we're working on, I'm going to connect him to one or two people so that he's linked in. And then our system too is that every mission that's launched has a weekly 1-hour meeting on Zoom. So we give them the background materials, the landscape, connect them to key people, and then plug them in so that they can attend one of those meetings. And usually they've got enough sort of things to, potentially attach to. And it's growing all the time. We up until a few months ago, were really two missions, one R&D, one advocacy. And now just suddenly, as members have come in and they've participated in these missions, they've now gotten to a confidence level where they're like, I have an idea. I'm going to spawn it and I'm going to introduce it on the platform. And now, so when someone comes in, they've got, I think we're up to 6 or 7 different potential things that they can plug into depending on their interest.
That's cool. Can you describe some of the R&D efforts that are underway?
Yeah, and this was kind of a real early, really our first idea going back to 2018 when me and, the other co-founder, Matt Adams, who's a game designer and a faculty member at NYU, I was interested in games as a sort of a frame of reference for how we design our community. Can you draw on certain game design elements to create feedback for people so they know what they're doing is sort of significant. But early on, he came from kind of a maker world to a degree. He was more of a techie, and we were like, we were kind of inspired by one of the godfathers of the direct air capture world, Klaus Lochner. We're like, we should make a small open source direct air capture machine. So direct air capture is a technology that you may have read about. It's having kind of a moment now where it chemically absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so we're going to need a lot of that as part of a portfolio of carbon dioxide removal. And for different reasons, it appealed to us to say, let's make a small one that we can publish online under an open source license and build a community around rapidly evolving that. And that was called, we could name that Violet. And we connected with a DACC research engineer based in China at the University of Zhejiang, Dr. Tao Wang, who studied with Klaus Lochner at Columbia a decade earlier. And he runs a lab in China around sort of small modular DACC. And so we were like, all right, well, let's talk to him. And he was really interested in the idea of an open source community, potentially improving or helping him even with his research. So we started there, and we were going at there's some legal issues and, IP things that we had to look through, and we're going at a pretty good pace. COVID hit, that was disruptive. And then now we finally really sort of picked that up, and we're just weeks away from assembling that first unit of that. So awesome. That's Violet. That team meets on Saturday mornings, Eastern time.
What is the potential of that prototype? Like how much quantity can it remove?
Yeah, this one is just, this is just a 1 kg per day unit. It's what we call a moisture swing direct air capture. So the carbon absorption and release is based on the humidity. So when it's dry, it absorbs, and then when you wet it, it releases. And what we like about that technology is it's very solid state, requires very little energy input. So we thought that was, also conducive for people building it. You know what I mean? It's more conducive to miniaturization. And part of it is like, we don't know what direction it's going to go in. I think that's part of our sort of ethos in general is, let's just get the thing out there and see what sort of happens to it. And it can even just be something that provokes thinking about it. It's not even what happens to this unit per se, but maybe inspires somebody to do a similar thing, and they publish it, on GitHub under open air. So, and that's already happened. So we have another mission that came out of nowhere. An amazing member of ours, Dahl Winters, who's a computer scientist and biologist based in Denver, and she's come up with this really tiny DIY, tiny box, $60 to $80 build that mineralizes CO2 using calcium hydroxide. A project called Cyan. And so she was inspired by Violet, and they'd made this much simpler one. And what's cool about it is that people can build that right now. That's actually, we have that. You can come to our community and we'll share the GitHub and, all of that, the repository, we can get all the files. But what's cool is that it allows people who come in a bottom rung on the ladder. It could be a student, it could be anybody, like, what does this even mean? You build that. And then you're like, okay, well, maybe I'm going to do my own, or I'm going to do Violet or something like that. So it kind of filled in a real important sort of first step, I think, for people coming in, which has been awesome. It's been an amazing thing to witness.
So it's a great educational tool, and also like an initial win so that people feel some momentum and want to move forward.
Bingo. That's exactly it. Yep.
Awesome. Cool. And then, so the other main arm would be on the advocacy side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So advocacy, we define really broadly, and we have some kind of influences there. Our first mission, which we launched or started to launch just a few months after kind of the Violet idea got going. So this is back in the spring of 2019, is a policy initiative. We're trying to introduce legislation in New York State, and now that's spread to other states. So policy is key. I come from a solar background. You have to have a conducive policy environment in order to get liftoff for these key technologies, particularly when you need to do it fast, because we're up against obviously the clock, to say the least, with climate change. But we define advocacy actually quite broadly. There's the policy activism, which involves us making the policy. So our members actually don't just advocate for something that a professional staff came up with. We come up with the idea and we do the research and we collectively develop the policy idea. And then we try to get it introduced through the legislature. But other stuff that we're looking at, which is just starting to take shape now, is kind of falls under the category of what we call activist business development. We want to see in the next decade CDR projects take root rapidly and spread. So part of our job, we say, is how do we kind of close gaps? Almost think of ourselves as pro bono consultants or, technical assistants, where we want to make a direct air capture project happen at a vertical farm or an indoor greenhouse, where it could be useful, or at a concrete facility where the CO2 could be injected into the concrete and mineralized. That won't happen by itself necessarily, because you have the DACC companies are small and they're focused on what they have to do. And then the vertical farm companies or what have you have their things to do. So we want to be the ones that come in, fill the gaps, do the due diligence, and maybe make those projects happen. And we think right now it's hugely important just to get real projects happening. You know what I mean? Then things, once you get it into the world, things can really start to evolve. So that's a role we're starting to play as well. And then also sort of almost like a fan club, online fan clubs are powerful agents for actually supporting whatever they're a fan of. And they're very creative, sometimes formidable. So we look at some of these companies in the carbon removal space could use a fan club, whether that's trying to get 200 people to buy their product right now and then promote it online. So we look at ourselves as trying to amplify some of these startup companies as well. So that's what we kind of broadly define as advocacy. A big inspiration for me, again, going back to grad school, I guess it was a worthwhile investment. There's a book I read that almost nobody has read. I'm always the one introduced to people, called Market Rebels by an academic at Stanford, I believe, called Haragriva Rao. And he kind of tells the history of how activists are generally behind a lot of the most revolutionary, consequential technologies that we enjoy, and that it takes enthusiasts, informal, affinity groups to usually come in and play a role that companies by themselves. We give Henry Ford all of the credit for developing the automobile, but in reality, there was these sort of grassroots enthusiasts about cars that were the ones that advocated for its safety, that wrote the first traffic laws, that did demonstrations of cars in public so people weren't afraid that it was going to blow up and destroy the town. And we look at ourselves as modern day versions of that are enhanced by the internet, by all the powers that can be brought to bear when you can really network people together. So we're kind of market rebels, I guess, in that sense, for carbon dioxide removal.
That's great. Do you have any products that you're actively forming fan groups around right now?
Well, we have an awesome member based in Richmond who's just starting what we're calling the Carbon Buyers Club. So here's where once a month with our growing community, we're going to identify some company that we think is cool. And it's going to be our job, both internally within our community and externally, to try to raise money for those. And each month doing, we're experimenting with, sort of games that we could do, or raffles, or how we're going to do it. And we don't know which one, but it'll be monthly. I mean, there's certainly a number to choose from. I think one that would make sense off the bat is a company like Climeworks, the Swiss direct air capture company that now sells subscriptions for people who could say, I want to buy 7 tons of carbon removal that your machine in Iceland is going to remove and put into basalt rock, in Iceland. That's a good one to start, because it has the value of supporting that company and educating people who are trying to get to participate in it about what it is that we're talking about. But there's a whole bunch of fun options. There's both subscription-based types of things. Tomorrow's Air, a really cool new company that's focused on aviation carbon removal. Then there's product companies that, like Air Company, that make vodka out of carbon that's taken from the air, or diamond companies as well that are making carbon based out of that. So we'll do it that way. And we'll just, like with everything with open air, we're just going to iterate. and we're just going to see what the hell happens. And so far, that's actually worked pretty well. We won't anticipate too many steps ahead. We'll just let it sort of organically take shape.
That's funny. It kind of reminds me of my motto with sustainability now is I just started walking down the path and let it unfold in front of me, because you never quite know where you're going, but it always is someplace good.
That is so true in every facet. We were talking about, we were kind of had our advocacy call every Wednesday. Our advocates get on and we kind of talk about general subjects about how to be a more effective advocate. This is an opportunity for people to pitch new mission ideas, or we invite a special guest to talk about some tactic. But we were just reflecting on how, with your own journey and sustainability, just moving forward, but also as activists, you just gotta take shots on goal. You just gotta make that call to that person who you think won't call. There's so many things just about going ahead and making progress, and then things open up as you move forward, both in terms of your understanding and your effectiveness, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the advocacy side of things, can you talk a little bit about the legislation that you worked on up in New York?
Yeah, definitely. Again, which is now spread to New Jersey and has very good prospects in multiple other states, including in the UK. And so when you're talking about carbon removal and you hear about, whether it's the, IPCC 1.5, C report, or, any number of reports that are now out that show we can't just reduce emissions, stop emissions. We have to pull carbon out of the air now in order to stay, at a safe temperature level. So when you encounter that and you see things like gigatons and, all this, and you find out what that means, it's completely overwhelming, I think, over a long time span. So what we try to focus on a lot is we don't lose sight of those huge goals that we have to achieve. And this, I see this with my own solar experience. So much of it is about the next 10 years and scaling it to a certain degree so that the price comes down, business models are established, and technology evolves in a certain direction. And that will put us at a position to take off, to start talking about gigaton scales. So to do that, for direct air capture in the short term, we have to look at what are sectors of the economy that DACC could potentially integrate with or solve problems for, and how do we strategically connect ourselves to those sectors and try to create opportunities for carbon removal to happen. And one of them, there's many of them, but one is that's incredibly exciting is concrete. I know Bill Gates was just on 60 Minutes. Everybody's sending this to me. He talks about it. It's having a bit of a moment, I think, where people are understanding the connection between concrete and its main binding ingredient, cement, and climate change. It's a major source of emissions, but people are hearing more about the opportunities to take carbon and lock it away in concrete, where it would then functionally be stored forever. Nothing's going to get that out unless you heat it up to 2,000 degrees. And there's many opportunities with the different ingredients of concrete to do that. And why is that exciting with concrete? Concrete is the second most used material on Earth after water. So we don't even exactly know, between 35 to 50 billion tons of it per year. So you're talking about a huge universal material, and one that's also not going away in any time frame that's meaningful to the climate. It's not like we're talking about renewables displacing fossil fuels, or internal combustion engines being replaced by electric vehicles. There's just unique properties about concrete, and it's so ingrained in building practices. And the materials that make it up are irreplaceable in terms of their availability to meet construction demand. So if you accept that we're sort of stuck with it and that we also can utilize carbon in it, it's a good place to sort of really focus. Well, how can we get carbon removal really integrated in? How can we reinvent or reprogram concrete? So what we decided is, all right, well, let's focus on that. And luckily I come from a solar and renewables background. I've worked on a number of legislative campaigns on the state level, and I had good relationships with some legislators through that. And me and our early core of founders were like, let's just try to get something done. So I sort of pitched in the abstract to an excellent assembly member in Brooklyn named Robert Carroll, really true climate legislator. I'd worked on with some stuff. And I said, there's this thing called negative emissions. You probably haven't heard about it yet, but we have to do something about this. And why not New York, since we're taking huge leads already in terms of climate policy? And it was like, go find something that actually makes a difference that we can do on the state level. That's not symbolic, but something that would actually make a difference. So I connected with one of the world's leading, kind of carbon dioxide removal policy and technical experts, a guy named Professor Julio Friedman at Columbia. Just called him up and he said, all right, well, let's talk. And we brainstormed a couple of ideas, and pretty quickly we converged on focus on concrete for the reasons I just said, and focus on government procurement of concrete, because governments are generally, states are generally the largest single purchaser of concrete within any state. So the decisions they make around concrete can have a really big ripple effect, creating early demand, early adoption for emerging technologies. And, and it starts to really sort of have a ripple effect across the economy. So I spent that summer with a couple of other members on a Google Doc, calling up everybody, advocates in California and West Coast and all over the place, and people in industry, people in academia. And we came up with this idea for what's called the Low Embodied Carbon Concrete Leadership Act, which basically requires the state to implement a climate impact standard for its concrete procurement. And it incentivizes concrete providers to adopt low carbon options, because that actually makes their bids more competitive. So it has this sort of what we call climate competition model. And again, that was crowdsourced essentially because we didn't know much about it. So we had to depend on the expertise of a large group of people. And so we developed that bill. It was introduced in Climate Week rather of 2019 in the Assembly. We made really good, steady progress picking up co-sponsors. It started to gain momentum. It's a problem that people are trying to solve. There's not many policies to address it. COVID hit, slowed us down a little bit, but then we managed to engage with a really influential climate leader in the Senate, who's the Senator Kaminsky, Todd Kaminsky, who's the chair of the Environmental Conservation Committee. And he did a lot of research. His team took really kick the tires on it and talked to all sorts of different stakeholders. And then they decided after a few months of analysis to introduce it in the Senate. And so we had this very powerful, influential senator now sponsoring our bill. And then things really just started to pick up. We picked up some positive news media. We got a great op-ed from Jigar Shah, who's an extremely influential figure in the solar field, who's now sort of turned his attention to materials. And it just kind of really seemed to scratch an itch, I think, that a lot of climate people were sort of looking to address in New York. And we don't know. We're in the session right now. We're hoping it will pass. We're pushing and pushing. But what happened in parallel to that is we had an activist join our community probably in the late summer, if not even later, who Sue Dorward, who's works at a community college as a sustainability coordinator, is really plugged into all this. And she's like, you know what, I think I can get this introduced in New Jersey. So she started her own sort of journey of, plugging into legislators and recruiting a little team, recruiting support orgs, and then got the bill introduced in January in the Assembly with the Assembly members Wicker. So we have that bill introduced in Jersey. And then in parallel, we have folks in Wisconsin, Ohio, Colorado, Virginia, that are also in conversations with potential sponsors. And now we have a group of folks in the UK that are trying to actually get the bill introduced as a federal legislation in the United Kingdom. So all of this with no formal organization, not a single dollar of budget, and no real experts in any of these things, but yet somehow it moved fast in the ways that we sort of hoped it would as an open source network. We're not inhibited by a lot of things that organizations are.
Yeah, that's great. No board meetings and consensus documents and all of that kind of stuff getting in the way.
Yeah, or just constrained by X number of staff, and therefore you have to prioritize this, and you have donors that you have to satisfy. We can kind of call our own shots, and it's just, you can move pretty quickly when you do that.
That's great. So the focus of all of these laws is on government procurement, or just procurement overall?
Yeah, government procurement, which we think will, have a big impact.
Sure. And then, if you've got to make it that way to win the government contracts, then you're already making it that way to sell to the private developers.
Totally. So that's the thing that's really exciting about it. It's not just that purchasing power of the government. It's so much of it right now is just about nudging the industry and its whole supply chain in a certain direction. And once they cross that threshold, they only have to do that once. And then why not market that to an increasingly climate conscious, sort of private sector as well? So that's you're exactly right. That's a big hope of it. It'll have that ripple effect. Yeah.
What are some of the solutions that the concrete companies will need to implement in order to win those bids, to be more carbon friendly than the competition?
Yeah. So that's one of the things that we like about the bill is it doesn't specify what those are. It basically takes a very common life cycle analysis called an environmental product declaration, which California uses and some municipalities. It's established LCA, life cycle analysis, from the green building trade. And that generates a number that assesses what the climate impact or the global warming potential is from like the quarry to the factory, as we say, like the whole kind of like supply chain. And so we take that number, and that's the number that you get graded on from your competitiveness point. So it doesn't say use this, it doesn't specify or prescribe particular technologies. It does have an added bonus for, in New York, what we call breakthrough technologies. In New Jersey, it specifically refers to carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies, which is a broad range of emerging technologies that have to get accelerated because up to almost 50% of decarbonizing cement and concrete has to come from some form of carbon capture and utilization because of the specifics of how cement is made. It's crazy, but
it's got to be a large capture to even offset the amount of fuel that goes into heating up the cement.
yeah, and the fuel, which is nasty enough, I mean, you have to get up to like 2000 degrees, and you really have to use an energy dense fuel. So that usually means a fossil fuel. But that's only 40% of the emissions. From cement is 90% of the emissions typically of concrete, and it's only about 10 to 15% of the volume. But the other thing is just you're breaking down limestone to make the core ingredient of cement, which is called clinker. And limestone is made of carbon. So when you heat that up, this pyroprocessing thing, it releases a ton of carbon just chemically, what we call process emissions. And that's like 50 to 60% of the emissions. So even if you have the most efficient plant and you were sort of magically able to, swap out the fuel to a carbon negative, you still have these other significant emissions that just come from that chemical process. So, but to answer your question about what this does is there's many things. We talk about low embodied carbon concrete. We have to educate people that that's not some special concrete that comes out of a special low embodied carbon concrete, batch plant. It's a spectrum of different solutions that can be done in isolation or stacked on top of each other, at a conventional concrete plant, which is great. So we're not talking about displacing, concrete plants. We're talking about enhancing them, getting them to adopt technologies or options. And these really span the range. Some of it is just this argument around, do we overuse cement? Do we go overkill on cement for a lot of applications that do not require as much cement? So it's about just being a little more parsimonious or, thinking about how much cement we sort of use. So that's one thing that's not high tech in any kind of way. Then there's the various substitutions for cement. If you can start to reduce the cement content, you're directly reducing the carbon footprint for reasons that I said. Many of these options have been around forever. They've been around for a long time, and they've been adopted because they reduce the cost because they often are cheaper than cement, and they increase the strength. And that's why they're adopted. And then we kind of discovered that there's a climate benefit. So those are things like industrial waste products like fly ash and slag from, coal and steel respectively. Fly ash is starting to go away because we're reducing our coal use, and it's expensive to import it from other places, and it has to get processed. So that's kind of pricing itself out. So you're seeing that more scarce now, where we are. So it creates room for other alternatives like calcined clay and silica fume. And then one that I'm really excited about that I'm constantly talking about is ground glass pozzolan. So you can take glass that can no longer be recycled. That's an issue that we're seeing at the municipal level all over the country, and grind that up in a fine powder called a pozzolan, and that can be used as a substitute for cement. So there you're solving a waste stream problem, you're localizing your input, and you're reducing a carbon thing. So it's just like poetry, from a material standpoint. And more of those will continue to emerge over time. So those are all things that you'd say are either totally ready right now or really just right there. And then you get into things where you're optimizing the size of the aggregate. That's the, the sand and gravel that makes up 80%. It's such an elemental thing. And there, the size of the aggregate actually can have an impact on strength and how much cement you need to use. So that's relatively, it's knowledge, intensive, and there's supply issues around that, but it's a doable thing that if demand was there, we'd start seeing more of that show up in local markets. And then you get into this really exciting category that I mentioned before, which are broadly called carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies. So those can be anything from a cement plant capturing carbon and using it in things, or geologically storing it, all the way through the supply chain, where one at the end of the supply chain that a lot of people have talked about, New Jersey itself has a company called Solidia, which is kind of one of the superstars of this emerging field, where they use carbon in the concrete to displace cement and store carbon. There's another company called Carbon Cure based in Canada that has deployments all over North America and multiple continents that injects carbon dioxide right at the very final stages of the concrete making process. And that stores a little bit of carbon, but that little bit of carbon actually displaces water use and cement use, and it makes it stronger. And then in between that, there's all sorts of companies now that are looking to a really fascinating company called Blue Planet, which has got a whole bunch of investment and a valuable partnership, which is starting to make that aggregate out of carbon dioxide. It's coating it with carbon dioxide. And again, if you're talking about the part of a material that we pour 50 billion tons of, and you're talking about the part of it that represents 80% of that, and you're starting to make that out of carbon dioxide, now you're really talking about some serious impact. And there's other companies
40 billion tons.
Yeah, exactly. So,
right.
So that's why we got, you can start to see why we were excited about it as negative emissions people. It's like, this is stuff that maybe right now will come from post-industrial emissions, which is fine. But you can also, for reasons I won't get into, there's real business cases for integrating direct air capture with a lot of those companies. It can, once the pricing comes down, it starts to solve a real problem for them that is not solved by post-industrial emissions. So that was one of the reasons why we originally focused on it. Yeah. That's a long-winded, detailed answer to your question. I have a hard time containing myself sometimes with this stuff.
Yeah, and let's say, direct air capture takes off and succeeds, and it solves the problem. We've got to do something with all that carbon once we capture it. So why not find a way to put it into cement?
Yeah. And I think that the next decade, geological storage we have abundant possibilities for that. And there's certain parts of the United States where there's already some infrastructure in place where we can do that, the Permian Basin and stuff like that. But we have to develop a lot more. And it really requires giant economies of scale. You have to go big or go home with that. And so little DACC companies are not going to be investing in giant geological storage projects on land and offshore. That's going to have to be driven by, policy inducements that probably large polluting industries are going to have to make most of the sort of plays in that, So in the meantime, as that infrastructure is taking shape, that carbon, as you just said, we have to be putting it into things. That's what the utilization is. We have to be utilizing the carbon in ways that locks it away. And concrete is great, because concrete is, again, just such a massively universal material.
And if you, if you find a great storage facility and it's 200,000 miles away or whatever, you're using fuel to get it there. So you're undoing some of what you just did to capture. So local storage is key to that equation.
Yeah, unless it's pipelines. But as we know, pipelines are not the easiest thing in the world to get, installed, and they come with their own sort of politics, regardless of what's moving through them. And so just these are hugely CapEx intensive, politically fraught investments, that are going to take time to sort of figure out to do in a fair and equitable way, and to, get the policies in place that incentivize their construction. So in the meantime, we don't want to wait for that to get that going. So let's put it in concrete and other things.
Yeah, keep it local.
Yep.
With some other really exciting technologies that we've been following as well. A friend of ours has a company out of Australia. They're making bioepoxy out of the waste byproduct of biodiesel. And cool. So they're turning that, the glycerol that's left over when you make the biodiesel out of any, plant-based production. And they're turning that into epoxy. And they're right now doing some trial tests with Lafarge Holcim to use it as a concrete additive. So there'd be some prime candidates to start moving that product here into the Northeast, where these new regulations are coming in favoring that kind of product.
So that's just a great example. So that company, I don't know, I'd have to look at their spec sheet and talk to them, but what we hope is through this bill, because it's based on this general number, this life cycle analysis number, that it creates a marketplace for all kinds of companies to have a customer, so that if that turns out to be a displacement of cement or has some other carbon reducing feature that could be verified through a life cycle analysis, they would be well positioned then as a company in the state of New York because of this bill, or the state of New Jersey, when it passes.
As part of the puzzle, they add that in as, displacing some of the concrete with a plant-based product that sequestered carbon to begin with and brought it along and moved it into the concrete. They make it with algae and all different kinds of plants. It's pretty exciting stuff.
You got to connect me to those guys. I want to talk to them.
Definitely will do.
That's awesome.
And then, so the idea of keeping it local, I think, is awesome as well. So, why not find the solutions and use them right in your own backyard instead of paying to ship it wherever it goes.
Yeah. We have also a particular take on localism that is a little different from the one that I think it has primacy in the environmental movement. When it comes to the policy side, we really focus a lot on state and municipal policy. And that's not necessarily so much because we think everything has to be localized. It's because there's just more targets. And part of our idea with advocacy is let's get a good policy to emerge somewhere and then have it replicated horizontally. And with any luck, it gets then inspires federal policy. So we think states and cities move faster, even though they don't have certain resources and authorities that the federal government does. Let's get something rolling wherever we feel like there's an opportunity and see how that inspires more horizontal action. So that's kind of our commitment to localism, is more around just more opportunities, I think, for sort of innovation.
And quicker wins too. You got a lot less,
exactly.
A lot less players that you need to line up to get anything done.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So any other fun things out there on the horizon that you want to sort of tease a little bit that are sort of percolating but not quite ready?
Yeah. I mean, I think what's fun, I think for us now, is I always have to kind of pivot back between being involved in missions and trying to create an environment that's conducive to missions. So there's the medium and then the content, I guess. And so there's exciting things, I think, just how we're trying to, a new website that we're developing in March that'll be a lot easier for people to almost window shop for our missions, so they know what we're about before they come into our community. Really excited about that. Really excited about this little, what I already mentioned, this Carbon Buyers Club and where that can go. And we like things that you can start really simply and test. And this has all the markings of that. So I'm hoping in 6 months that becomes much more of a sort of a thing. The fact that we have these 2 R&D projects, that the Cyan project is just so fun and so exciting because it's almost like direct air capture as meme. It's so simple, the thing that we think people can really, their minds can be applied to it and they can think creatively about how to use it, and it's cheap. So I really hope that we can get teachers and, parents who are trying to figure out stuff to do with their kids that are home from school, that could really potentially kind of take off in sort of a rapid way and inspire interest more generally in DIY direct air capture. And so keep your eyes on that. And then what's also exciting is we have more, LECCLA has been this amazing just experience of, can we develop a policy like this from scratch as a bunch of just amateurs, and will we succeed at it? And I think we've proven to ourselves that yes, that can at least, even if none of them pass right now, we've done something correct here. So now we've kind of jacked up our ambitions a little bit, and we have a really interesting policy that's much more ambitious for the state of New York that relates to sort of carbon removal commitments, and how do we relate that to the state's, kind of landmark climate law? How do you bake in some portion of our overall carbon reduction goals into carbon removal? And that'll be a really big lift, but we're starting to develop that through an interesting sort of almost crowd-based process where we're doing a series of these sort of input sessions from different stakeholders, and hoping to have something relatively finished for that to show to the world by Earth Day.
Awesome.
So that once that goes live, particularly if people in other states are like, let's do it, that'll be a big deal. I think for us, at least, that'll be a kind of the center of gravity, I think, for at least for our advocacy work.
Big momentum builder.
Yeah, exactly. And then I mentioned also this activist business development. So we have an awesome member of Open Air based in California named Asa Kamer, who is leading, we want to see what it takes to get a direct air capture deployed in some form of indoor agriculture. So we're doing research both on the indoor agriculture side and on the DACC side, with the idea of maybe doing something like a request for information, or we're just trying to find out where's the market, and then can we potentially work with some indoor agricultural companies, vertical farm companies, to actually help facilitate maybe an RFP process. So I'm really excited about that specific project, but seeing how we as a amateur network can play that kind of a role and fill that kind of gap. And that mission is already launched as well. So anyway, I think I could say those specific things, but I'm specific. Where are we going to be in 6 months as more people come in and, new missions are founded? What do we look like, are we an environment for missions in 6 months? That's sort of my hope.
Great. And we've got another connection for you on that vertical farming front too. We did an interview about a month or so ago with Eden Green Technology. They're doing large scale indoor farming, like acre size, big stuff.
Oh, cool.
So,
where are they based?
They're out of Texas.
Okay.
And they're just getting started with their first facility right now. But I think they've got some advantages over some of the other vertical farmers. It's definitely worth checking them out. You can see an interview with them on sustainabilitynow.global. And
Okay.
while I'm mentioning that, I should point out that everything that we're talking about today, we'll put up links to all of your content and other ways people can get involved in the show notes page about this interview. Anybody listening, just go to the website and check it out, and we'll have ways you can get active.
Fantastic. Yeah, please connect me with that Texas company, because right now we really are in the process of doing our due diligence and research. So I'd love to talk to them.
Perfect. Yeah. And I guess speaking of how people can get involved, what else do you think we can recommend to folks as ways to help support what you've got going on?
Yeah, I would say go to our website. We have the join there. You fill that out. It takes 2 seconds. And that's sort of the knock on our door. All the action really takes place in our Discord server. So we'll look at that. We'll email you back with a link and say, come on in. And then, as I said before, you come in, someone will greet you, and then we'll set up, within the next little short period of time, whenever it's convenient for both people, a short 20-minute conversations with one of our members, who again will give you the kind of the lay of the land. Once a month now, we also do a general orientation. We now also have a game night once a month, which is just a good, again, my co-founder is a game designer, so that helps. Just a good casual icebreaker kind of community builder. There's opportunities to attend one of these, be even just as a fly on the wall, one of these weekly meetings for our mission. So once you come inside, we'll just kind of give you some guidance on it, and you can see if it's for you. But again, we're expanding our opportunities for people to involve as our missions sort of multiply. So, if you come in, hopefully there's something we can find for you. And the other thing I should really stress is that, it's no matter what you do or what your background is. I'm not just saying this to be, cheesy or Pollyannish. There's something for you to contribute. I promise you that, there's just, whether it's a knowledge or a connection or where you are, or just your sheer willingness to put in time, there are ways to be a contributor to what we're doing. I guarantee it. So come on in and we'll show you around, and you can figure that out.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah, we've noticed a lot of the same kind of activity on our weekly movie nights that we do every Thursday night. With the question and answers afterwards, we've really just been overwhelmed with the connections that have been made, and the partnerships that are growing, and things that we never would have imagined are being sparked out of there. And it's really great. Awesome to see.
Yeah, you just get people together. It's amazing what happens,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
If I could make one other plug too, which isn't directly open air, but I understand that a lot of people, while there's been a lot of progress in elevating awareness and understanding of carbon dioxide removal just in the last year, even less, there's still a lot of people who aren't quite clear on what we mean by that. Are we talking not only just in terms of what specific solutions we're talking about, but are we talking about that instead of renewables, or, where we stand on this is we're not talking about it instead of any mitigation effort. You do all of those things now and fast and as rapidly as we possibly can. Our acceptance of CDR has more to do with the fact that the ship has already sailed, that we have to reduce carbon from the atmosphere, remove it from the atmosphere now. We don't have any other option. So there's a really great resource that came out just recently called the CDR Primer. It's a free online book called it's cdrprimer.org. And it was written really by some of the leading figures in carbon dioxide removal in academia and policy, in the private sector. Just really rigorously put together. And it's an amazing resource, highly readable for a lay audience. I'm not a scientist. And it's just a good way to kind of wrap your head around the urgency of this need and what it might look like, what has to happen in order for CDR to really sort of be elevated to the level that it needs to be in order to solve the problem. So cdrprimer.org, highly recommend taking a look at that. It's free.
Awesome. Yeah, it's great. I'll have to check that one out too. Haven't heard of that one yet.
It just came out last month. Yeah, it's new.
I guess that's why. Cool. Well, thanks so much for joining, Chris. It's been super enlightful, and can't wait to hear where you guys go next. I'll be keeping my eye on the legislation and seeing what kind of local activity we can help get some citizen action involvement to push some of the more of our politicians to sign on and get this thing done.
Yeah, awesome, man. So we'll definitely keep up the conversation. I'm really honored to be on here, and good luck again with your own community, which sounds like it's really thriving.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Cool. Well, thanks everybody. Want to give a shout out to Mira Rubin, my co-founder and your usual host for the podcast. And just reminded that that's why we're here. Everybody listening, you can do what you can to make a difference, and working together, we can shape a world that works.
Thank you for listening to Sustainability Now. Visit sustainabilitynow.global to find resources related to today's program. While you're there, pledge your support by making a contribution to help us shape a world that works. And remember to subscribe, share, and follow us on social media.